Okay, so now we'll have a second video in anticipation of Monday's meeting. Again, I apologize for not having this in order for Wednesday. I simply forgot that it needed to be done. I don't have a good excuse. It should have been done, and I didn't. So we were talking about original sin in the prior video. Today, well, this video, not today. We're going to talk about personal sin starting on page 134. Now, this is the stuff that belongs to us. Okay, original sin, we suffer the consequences of what our forefathers did, and to some extent, when we're talking about generational sin, again, we can potentially suffer as a result of the misdeeds of like our parents or grandparents, or going, I mean, the scripture says, I think, up to the 6th or 7th generation. We're not really necessarily at fault for those necessarily. I could go into finer detail on that, but I mean, if you're inheriting a tendency towards a sin, that inheritance isn't specifically your fault. What you do with it ultimately is, and that, so what you do with the decisions that are given to you on any given day, whether you choose to do what is right or not, now we're talking about personal sin. And this can be categorized in any number of different ways, starting on page 135. So, C2a talks about according to the virtues or goods that the sin opposes. So, for example, the book uses the example of adultery. This stands in opposition to the virtue of fidelity, of honesty, of loyalty, and in particular in the unique circumstance of a marriage between a man and a woman. It's a very specific type of sin, but it is not something that can ever happen. Adultery does not happen by accident. I mean, aside from the physical impossibilities of this, there's a simple reality that you put yourself into a position, whether you were fully in control of those circumstances or not, there was always an opportunity to say, no, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to cheat on my spouse. Note the term cheat. And then you chose to do so. That's on you. And it's a violation of the virtue of fidelity, of faithfulness, of loyalty. Or, to use a slight variation on this, look to C2b. According to the commandments they violate, you're told to tell the truth. You cheat on a test, or your parents ask you a question that requires you to tell the truth. You don't want to get in trouble, so you lie. It's a violation of the commandment. See how that's very similar potential to a violation of the virtue. The only difference between the two is the thing you violated, is it listed in the commandments? If not, then it's quite possibly, but not always, a virtue violation. For instance, to give an example of the difference between these two, we talked about in the prior video the notion of the sin of gluttony. Now, is there anywhere in the commandments where it says, thou shalt not overeat, or thou shalt not overindulge? It ain't there. That's not a commandment. Okay? But nevertheless, there is still a virtue that we are supposed to take things, the notion of temperance, okay? We're supposed to take things in their proper moderation. There is the entire pizza. You are very hungry. Maybe you eat one, maybe you eat 2 slices. Not all of them. Because if you eat all of them, now you're engaging in a violation of the virtue of temperance. It's not a commandment violation, it's a virtue violation. But either one potentially is a form of sin. So you can have violations according to virtues, you can have violations according to commandments, or if you look at C2c, still on page 135, you can talk about according to whom they offend or concern. Now there's a couple of different ways that this can happen. First, let's take a look at the issue of gossip. Okay? You are talking about someone else. Now, is it specifically sinful to talk about anyone else? Not necessarily. Okay, I am sure you guys talk about your teachers on a regular basis. I would not be surprised if you actually talk about me. And I'm sure there are times where someone says, yeah, Powers did this well, or Powers did this wrong. Can you believe he did this? Whatever. In and of itself is the notion of talking about someone else. Is that automatically a bad thing? And the answer is obviously not. You're planning a surprise birthday party for someone. You got to talk about them. Can you do it in front of them? Well, if you want it to be a surprise, no, you can't. Okay? So the action of talking about someone else is not an issue. But what is the purpose of the talking? If you're planning a birthday party, that's perfectly fine. If you're comparing notes about a teacher that you have a concern with, is that in and of itself a bad thing? No, not necessarily. But what if you're getting together with someone just to talk smack about someone else? Teacher, friend, whatever the case may be, parent, and you don't have any intention of fixing this, you're not trying to compare notes, you're just trying to vent. You're just trying to get someone else to buy in about why you don't like this person. Is that a problem? Quite possibly, because you are spreading information which may or may not be true about this person and sowing discontent. If you're really unhappy with someone, what are you supposed to do? This goes back to those 4 steps of loving correction. I will ask you that question on Monday, rather than talking about someone else. There's another example of a sin of where you can be offending someone else, and this is a slightly different notion. This is a concept of scandal. And this is where you are talking or acting in such a way that you are offending potentially a large group of people in your actions. They often talk about the sin of scandal in relation to the Catholic Church, like the scandal of those priests who did not treat the young people in their charge with the dignity and respect that they deserved. They ended up giving scandal to the entire church. What that meant is not only did they hurt those people that they offended individually, that's not the scandal. The scandal is it makes the entire Catholic Church look bad. I'll give another example of this sort of thing. So, the church teaches really quite strongly that abortion is a bad thing. Now, I'm a religion teacher. Okay? Now, let's say that I don't, mind you, but let's say personally I had this belief that, under certain circumstances, abortion is okay. We're going to talk about abortion later. Well, trust me, we're going to get into that. And let's just say that I think, personally, under certain circumstances, it's perfectly okay. And I actually teach this in class. That's giving a scandal as well, because it flies directly in the face of church teaching. The church is very clear on this. There is no circumstance where abortion is okay. And if I, as a religion teacher, start saying, no, under certain circumstances, it's actually okay, that's a problem. I'm giving scandal to the church. And if you go to your parents and say, I said abortion is okay, I'm going to refer them back to the video. I never said that. I was giving you a hypothetical. Okay, so, in terms of personal sin, you can sin according to virtue, you can sin according to commandment, you can sin according to who they offend or concern, you can sin according to what's called thought, word, deed, or emotion. That's page 136. I've turned the page. C2D. Okay? Thought, word, deed, or omission. Potentially to give an example of this sort of thing. Go back to adultery. Okay? So if I actually commit adultery, I engage in the act of being physically unfaithful with my wife. I end up cheating with someone else. Okay, that's deed. It's pretty straightforward. Sinning in word, not specifically with regards to adultery, but you can kind of illustrate that, again, when you're talking smack about someone else, when you're gossiping. Sin of thought. Let's say you're momentarily angry at somebody. Okay? Now, this is normal enough. That sort of instinct, whatever it is, someone said something bad, they bumped into you, they were talking smack about you, you found out about it, you're really angry with them. That initial anger is okay, but if you dwell on it, and you start thinking about how you'd like to hurt this person, or the vengeance you'd like to take out on it, or it gets even worse, you actually start to plot the vengeance you're going to take out upon them. Now we're talking about a sin of thought. Now you don't actually carry anything out. That's not a sin of deed or action. But it is still a sin of thought. There's this concept in Catholic teaching called concupiscence. So we're all occasionally tempted to particular things. You're, like I said, you're angry with someone, okay? There's that momentary temptation to be angry. I think I mentioned you guys were laughing at this back when we were able to meet individually. So you see someone attractive of the opposite sex walk by, and you happen to note, oh, wow, okay, that's a pretty person. That in and of itself, that's not a sinful thing. But if you continue to turn and watch the person walk away and say to yourself, boy, I'd hit that, now we've got a sin of thought. Is there specifically a sin of action? If I don't actually pursue the person and try to engage in a relationship with them, a physical relationship with them, then no. The deed's not there, but the thought is there. And persisting in the thought, you're not talking about the initial response, you're talking about the subsequent response. That can be a sin of thought. And finally, there's a sin of omission. All these others are commission. We do things. We do a thought. We do a deed. We do an action. We say a thing. These are all commissions. They're physically things that are added to the environment. Omission's different. Omission is where we don't do something when we should. I think I told you the story. Hopefully I'm not deluding myself. This time the car got into a severe accident just outside this apartment where my future wife and I were having dinner, and his car wrapped around a tree. And I came outside and I saw him hanging in kind of a bloody mess from the window, and then he started to move. If I had simply walked away and said, this is someone else's problem, the ambulance needs to take care of him, that arguably is a sin potentially of omission. And I ended up, I think I described to you, I ended up racing to him and I just tried to get him to hold still because I didn't want him to further injure his back. That's one example. A simpler example, you see someone coming towards the door and they are loaded with books and material. They need the door open for them and you just kind of watch the door shut. Arguably that too is a sin of omission. You didn't do anything specifically wrong, but you should have done something there. Sin of omission is when you're really kind of obligated to do something, but you choose not to. Then, finally, well, not finally, because there's technically two others, there's sins according to their gravity, mortal or venial. Venial is the everyday sort of sin we commit sometimes without even thinking. I, for one, you can argue I have a problem with cursing, particularly when I'm by myself. My problem is that it's habituated and I don't think about it. I get angry and I turn the air blue. For me, arguably, that's a venial sin. When I first started doing it, it was arguably mortal. A mortal sin consists of the following. It is a serious, grave offense. You know it's a grave offense, yet you choose to do it anyway. Like I will tell you right now, it is a grave offense to miss Mass when it's offered. Currently, we're in a state where it's not being offered. So is anyone in a state of mortal sin for not going to Mass? No, because you can't get there. It isn't happening. But if Mass is available and you simply say, I don't want to get out of bed, I ain't going, I'm here to tell you now, it's grave. And you know it's grave and you're choosing to do it, those are the three conditions. The sin has to be grave, you have to know it's grave, and you freely choose it anyway. That's mortal sin. Venial sin damages your relationship with God, the everyday sort of stuff that you do. Mortal sin breaks it. Venial sin can be cured by such things as sacramentals or even simply going to Mass. Mortal sin's a bit more serious. Gotta go to confession. If you don't go to confession, you are not in a sufficient state of grace to receive communion. You should choose not to take it until you have a chance to go to confession. I would like to talk a bit more actually in the group on Monday about confession and a bit more about mortal sin. Finally, I'm trying to keep this under 15 minutes. So, look at page 138 under social sin. This is a little bit more difficult to wrap your head around. It's kind of like, for lack of a better description, it's like you're participating in a sin that everyone else participates in. In college, you're going to be tempted with the social sin of getting wasted on weekends. I'd love to tell you the temptation's not going to be there. It's going to be there. And one of the things about your body is that you're supposed to take decent care of it, and getting mind-numbingly drunk is not taking care of things. Now, this, however, it's a social sin because it's commonly accepted on college campuses that on Fridays and Saturdays it's perfectly okay to get yourself wrecked. But it isn't. Just like in the time of Martin Luther King, it was socially acceptable to make all black people sit on the back of the bus. Or they couldn't sit at the lunch counter with the white people, or they couldn't, for God's sake, actually drink out of the same drinking fountains as white people. And everyone in the South took this as perfectly okay. It's perfectly acceptable. When it isn't. You're not treating people with the inherent dignity that they deserve, even if everyone else is doing it. Social sin is a real thing, and that's something else I think I'd like to talk a bit more about on Monday. With that, that'll be it for my two videos and your first experience, at least with regards to me, in flipped instruction. And again, I apologize for not having this ready for the Wednesday meet. We'll talk about this more on Monday. Have a good weekend.